Well, good morning. This is where I fall over the finish line. So we will end our study in Joshua today. We're going to begin in chapter 13 and end in chapter 24. If you think that's a lot of data, you're right. Okay. You're familiar with this, this chart here that shows the grand strategy. Joshua began at the beginning of this book on the plains of Moab over here, and he crossed the Jordan River, and he executed his big strategy, which was drive a wedge into the Canaanite land, split it in half, grab the high ground, destroy the strongholds of all the kings, and then divide everything up among the tribes and let each of the tribes go ahead and finish the process of cleansing the land and pushing out the Canaanites and taking over their inheritance. Now, we're at the point where we're ready to divide up the land. And most of those chapters that we're going to talk about have a lot of boundary markers in there. They read like a surveyor's logbook, so that's why we can jump over quite a bit of that. People have done that for us and put it out graphically. You'll see this chart again over here, and we'll explain it more thoroughly. But when you think about it, if they're going to divide up their inheritance, I mean, down to the level of the family or what farm you're going to take over, there was a lot of work to be done, right? You have to define acceptable boundaries. You're going to have to say, this is where your farm begins and where his farm ends. There are lots of questions like water rights and things like that. There was a huge amount of work to be done. But before we jump into that work, let's ask the question of what are the boundaries of the promised land? Where did they come from? People have sort of an amorphous view of this, and we need to get a better picture of it. And so it goes all the way back to the promises that were made to Abraham when he was Abram. Remember? He lived, he went from Ur of the Chaldees, which is way down by the Gulf, Persian Gulf, and he moved with his father to Haran, lived there for a number of years. When he was 75 years old, in chapter 12 of Genesis, God said, leave your father's house, leave your land, and go to a land that I will show you. Now, if God was to say that to you or me, we'd say, okay, where's that? And he'd say, I'll show you. And we would say, what are you going to do with it? I'm going to bless you. Okay. What are the boundaries? What does this all mean? Just go to the land that I've told you. I'll show you your way. And you know, that's the life of faith for everybody. That's why Abraham's called the father of the faithful, because he left his home and he went from Haran down into this land that we call the Levant. That's generally from the northeast corner of the Med to the southeast corner of the Med. That's the Levant. Or Palestine, normally is the old Roman province of Palestine. Canaan is down in here mostly. And he went down. The first place that he stopped was Shechem. And he put an altar to the Lord. And I'm going to give you all these verses. You can look them up yourself because we want to run through this fairly quickly. But once he set foot in the land and he put his altar up, God said, I'm going to give you all the land that you see, okay? And still doesn't tell him the extent of the land or the promises, just you're going to have this land, your descendants will have it. Well, later on, if you all remember the story, he and Lot separated. And they were on some high mountain in here, and Lot said, I'll take this rich, green, fertile valley to the right. Not rich, green, and fertile today, but back then it was. And Abraham said, fine, I'll stay here to the west. And after Lot left him, God says to you at this high place, I will give this land that you see, all that you can see, to you and your offspring forever. Now, he says, walk up and down in the land. That's exactly what he did. He walked up and down. He went to Egypt for a while and came back, you know. And so he was walking up and down in that land. But it's the first time that God says forever. So there's more to this than just, well, your kids, your descendants are going to live in this land. It's a lot more. So forever. And that's where we begin to get eschatological and talking about eternity. But then comes the famous covenant ceremony where God passes between the animals in Genesis 15. And that's the first time that he gives us some boundaries. And he says, I'm going to give this land to you, in general terms, from the Wadi of Egypt, or the river, the brook of Egypt, to the Euphrates. Okay, well, where are those? Well, that's why we've got this zoom out. Now, for those of you who are not big map people, just think you're way up high in an airplane or a satellite and you're looking down, okay? And this is the Mediterranean Sea, the island of Cyprus, Egypt, the Nile River. You all kind of with me on that? Okay. This is the brook of Egypt. It's called the Wadi of Egypt. And that's generally the boundary between Egypt proper and the Levant. This up here are the headwaters of the Euphrates River. Mesopotamia is in between the Euphrates and the Tigris, and that's what Iraq is today, okay? And so he's saying, I'm going to give it to you from the Wadi of Egypt all the way to the Euphrates River. So that's from here to here. It's kind of general, right? It's just the way he's given it to it. In chapter 17, verse 8, God calls it the whole land of Canaan. Well, whatever Canaan meant in those days, it was all of it. And we don't really know exactly, besides these two very, very proximate, very rough boundaries. Well, then that promise is reiterated to Isaac and to Jacob and down all the way through the time in Egypt to Moses. Now, Moses gets to the point in Numbers chapter 34 where God gives him a really clear picture of what the boundaries are. And Jack, would you start us reading Numbers 34, 1-2?
The Lord said to Moses, command the Israelites and say to them, when you enter Canaan, the land that will be allotted to you as an inheritance will have these boundaries.
All right. And if you continue reading, he'll say in verse 3, this is your southern boundary, and it's the Wadi of Egypt. This is your, verse 6, the western boundary. It's the Mediterranean Sea. Always has been the Mediterranean Sea right here. And then there's a northern boundary, and the eastern boundary includes, very significantly, the Jordan River. That's your eastern boundary. Keep that in mind. Take that, put that in your pocket. And the northern boundary that he gives includes what's called Hamath or Hamath. Okay, so keep that in your mind because we're going to see that in a couple places. All right. Now this is what somebody has drafted out based on that whole chapter, which you don't have to read, as to the boundaries that are given to Moses to assign the inheritance of Israel to the promised land, from the Wadi of Egypt through the south, goes south of Kadesh Barnea down to the lower part of the Dead Sea, up the Jordan River, all the way up to Hamath. So we've got a promise that there's the northern extent is at least up to here, Hamath, up to the Euphrates River. That's the extent of the promised land. So keep that in mind. What we're going to do now is we're going to zoom our map down, okay? And we're going to look just at this portion, okay? Just down in here. This is what you normally see when you see Israel, all right? There's the Galilee, Lake of Galilee, Sea of Galilee. There's the Dead Sea. There's the Jordan River. And normally that's all you ever see when you talk about Israel. We'll talk about that in a minute. Okay? This is the greatest extent that Israel ever occupied and ruled in the Old Testament. This is David and Solomon's kingdom, and it actually went up to the Euphrates River. And these portions here were the portions owned by the Phoenicians, but the Phoenicians were very close allies of Solomon, so there was no need to control them. They provided, for example, all the timbers for the temple. The red here, as requested by Jay numerous occasions, is the current boundary of the nation of Israel in the modern time. So you get a feeling as to where we are. Okay, now he's saying, I've got to parcel this land out, and that is a very tough task. You just got to have to think about it for a while. And God gave instructions to Moses on how to do it. If you go to Numbers 26 and beginning of Numbers, and it's up to you if you want to read all that, but I'll give you a start. They're on the plains of Moab, and God says to Moses, he says, take a census of the whole Israelite community. When's the last time they took a census? Anybody know? Well, when they left Sinai, okay, remember, it took about 3 months or 2 months to get to Mount Sinai from Egypt. They spent a year at Mount Sinai, and just before they left to go up to the promised land, they took a census. Why would they do that? What's going to happen? Military. There's a draft, right? You got to know how many soldiers you got. They're planning to go up into this land. They're going to have to conquer it. But what else are you going to have to do?
Feed provisions.
Well, feed logistics, that all has to do, but you need a census for that. They needed to know how many families there were in each tribe that would inherit a farm or land. That's that simple. They had to know who gets what. Now think about that. It turns out in the first census, they had about 602,000 soldiers that they could count on. Some odd number. And of course, they had to wander in the wilderness for 40 years, and all those people died. But now they take the census again, and you know how many they got? 602,000. They're back to where they started. Now compare that. In David's day, David took a census and a draft for which he was criticized, but he had 1.3 million. So it's a much different number. But they did that to find themselves an army. What do we have available to us to conquer the land? And then let's identify all the free Israelite families for parceling out the land. And some people estimate they would have gotten about 10 acres apiece. I think that's a really rough estimate. I don't know if that means anything. But there was essentially a farm for every person, every family in Israel. The instructions for allocating it are given in Numbers 26, 52 to 56, and I've put it up here. Jack, you want to read that for us?
The Lord said to Moses, the land is to be allotted to them as an inheritance based on the number of names. To a larger group, give a larger inheritance, and to a smaller group, a smaller one. Each is to receive its inheritance according to the number of those listed. Be sure that the land is distributed by lot. What each group inherits will be according to the names of for its ancestral tribe. Each inheritance is to be distributed by lot among the larger and smaller groups.
Okay, so we know that it's proportional to their population. Well, that makes sense. More people, more farms, more land, right? Makes sense. I don't know exactly how this was all done, and it appears that the tribes themselves had to take some part in this. They were supposed to go out and do the surveying. Think about this for a minute. It's a huge task. You've got a land office in town that has a record of all the deeds, and if you have land, you've got a deed in that office, right? If there's a right-of-way past or through your property, it's filed in that office. They had to do this for somewhere between 100 and 200,000 families. That's an enormous task. The organization had to be very sophisticated. And we already saw in chapter 14 how that Caleb came with with the elders of Judah, and they had a conflict, and they brought it to Joshua. And Caleb says, wait a minute, I may not be an Israelite, but Moses gave me an inheritance. And Judah says, you can't have our land. And he says, I get that inheritance. And Joshua had to judge. Imagine how much litigation there would be. Just huge task, a huge task. So here we are. You'll see this for a bit. This is the land as it was parceled out to the tribes of Israel at this time. This is allocated. This is what was occupied at the end of the book. And we'll get to that again as well, okay? Now, I want you to notice that there are several groups. Now, the chapters 20 and 21, we're going to rip through them real quick and not talk about them much. The cities of refuge and the 48 cities given to the tribe of Levi. But that left 12 tribes because Joseph's tribe was divided into two, Ephraim and Manasseh. Now, there are 4 groups in here we're going to look at. The tribes on the Transjordan, which would be east of the Jordan River. And then Judah, personified by Caleb. And then the tribes of Joseph, that's Ephraim and Manasseh. See, these are the big ones. Judah is this big, is way down here. Ephraim and Manasseh would be all this up here. So they're the big boys. They're the guys that are the most numerous and populous. And then in chapters 18 and 19, there are 7 tribes left. That'd be those little ones, Dan, Issachar, Zebulun, Naphtali, Asher, and so forth, okay? So what we don't want to do is we don't want to go through and look at their boundaries. Somebody's done that for us. So we can just look at the map and we can say that's what we're given. What I want us to look at is how each group in these chapters visualized or what their attitude was toward this inheritance. because there's something instructive for us in this. And I want you to think about that. See if you see yourself in any of this. First of all, you have in chapter 13, the boundaries of those whose inheritance was east of the Jordan River. Now, Joshua did not do this, all right? Israel wandered in the wilderness for about, well, they say 40 years before they crossed the Jordan, but it's 38 years. And after 38 years, they went onto the eastern side of the Jordan River and defeated two Amorite kings, Sihon and Og, and you hear about him a lot. Rahab said, we heard what happened, what the Lord did for you to Sihon and Og. They were Amorite, Canaanite kings. One of them, at least, was a giant, had the race of giants in there. We've talked about that before. And so these could not be left behind them militarily as they went into the promised land from the east to the west. And so Moses led the people of Israel up and down the coast until they had completely destroyed those armies. And then what happened is the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and part of Manasseh came to Moses and they said, we like it over here. We want to stay here. In chapter 32 of Numbers, verses 1-5. Jack, you want to read that for us?
The Reubenites and Gadites, who had very large herds and flocks, saw that the lands of Jazer and Gilead were suitable for livestock. So they came to Moses and Eleazar the priest and to the leaders of the community and said, Ataroth, Dibon, Jazer, Nimrah, Heshbon, Elelai, Sebam, Nebo, and Beon, the land the Lord subdued before the people of Israel, are suitable for livestock, and your servants have livestock. If we have found favor in your eyes, they said, let this land be given to your servants as our possession. Do not make us cross the Jordan.
Oh. What was their attitude toward their inheritance? What was their attitude towards the promised land?
They got what they wanted.
They got what they wanted. Exactly. They really weren't interested in the Lord's land. Now, you can go through, and it's pretty obvious from a number of passages that including the boundaries we just got from Moses, that the promised land is west of the Jordan River. Okay? In fact, when Moses was up on Pisgah in the plains of Moab, and God showed him the promised land, he's looking across the Jordan River to this whole land, and he says, this is the land I promised to give to Israel, but you may not cross over into it. Cross over what? Jordan River, right? So it was not God's plan for these guys to be here. It was God's plan for them to be on the west. Now I want to ask you a little question. Did you notice in the map that we went a lot further north than the Sea of Galilee and this little river by Tyre, didn't we? I mean, let me flip back real quickly. See, it went all the way up to Hamath. God had promised Abraham all the way back here to the Euphrates. We're talking about down here. Well, what happened to, what happened to the rest of all that up north here? Well, that's where these tribes probably would have been able to have their inheritance. And God, now I'll leave that up to you, but God says in there at one point, he says, don't bother, in chapter 13, the beginning, don't bother, he says, with this portion. He said, I'll drive the Sidonians out myself when the time comes. And I kind of wonder when that time will be, because never since that time has anybody taken that to Israel. Israel hasn't conquered that area. Now, there are intimations. Yeah.
Now we're Lebanon, Hezbollah, lobbing rockets in Israel from that area.
That's right. That's right. That's right. God says, I will drive them out myself. And I have a feeling, now we'll get into this. I told John, if I do this, we're going to go down a rabbit hole, and I don't want to, but I got to tell you something. In Ezekiel 38, they're talking about the end times, and it says there's going to come a time when the kingdoms of the north, Gog and Magog and so forth, are going to descend to the south, and they're going to come down on Israel living in peace, and they're going to wage war against them. And that war will be God will miraculously intervene, and it will be won by God's hand. And he will destroy all the armies on the slopes of Lebanon. So maybe, just maybe, these folks over here forfeited their inheritance, and God says, don't worry, I've got that in my plan. And that will someday, I will go ahead and drive them out myself. It's a thought. He did promise that land forever. Now, after chapter 13, we go to 14 and 15, and that talks about, oh, by the way, I just want to say something. That attitude that they have represents the attitude that some of us have where we really don't want to go all the way with Christ. We want to live in the penumbra of God's people, but we're really not interested in God's promises. Know anybody like that? We're kind of comfortable where we are in the world. And so we're going to stay right here. And we're going to forfeit our inheritance. They didn't have a very high view of their inheritance, did they? All right, on to 14. Now, he is still in Gilgal. Remember, Gilgal is right about here somewhere. And it's a central location from which they have been waging war. And so this must have happened very soon after the northern campaign and the campaign of the giants that we talked about last week was completed. All right? And at this point, the first two tribes to receive their inheritance come to Joshua. And that would be Judah and the tribes of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh. And they're the big ones. They're the big guys, right? So they give their inheritance to Judah. Now, if you look at chapters 14 and 15, I'm not going to go over them a whole lot. We did talk last week about Caleb, and Caleb is representative of the attitude that Judah had. Chapter 14, verse 12 kind of puts it in perspective. Go ahead, Jack.
Now give me this hill country that the Lord promised me that day. You yourself heard that the Anakites were there and their cities were large and fortified. But the Lord helping me, I will drive them out just as he said.
The Anakites, who were they? Sons of Anak were the giants, right? And you read later on that Caleb led the army down into that area, right down here. He received Hebron from Jerusalem all the way down to Debir. This was the hill country occupied by the Anakim, sons of Anak. They were giants. And they were the ones that everyone was so terrified of at the very beginning when they sent the spies in. And Caleb says, that's my inheritance. He's given it to me. I will go take it. He's aggressive. He's got faith that God will deliver it to him. And he was willing to go up to it. He valued his God-given inheritance. He claimed it, he fought for it, and he enjoyed it. His daughter was like him.
Isn't he 85 years old at this point?
He is 85 years old at that point. That's correct. He died later on, but he's 85. And he was a valiant guy. You loved him. And there's a reason that Jacob in his prophecy over his children said, the scepter will not depart from Judah. And who descends from Judah? Jesus does. David does. So the scepter remains with Judah. Great attitude toward their inheritance. But then you go on to 16 and 17. You can sort of flip through that if you want. But I want you to contrast the attitude of the Ephraimites and the folks from Manasseh with Caleb and Judah. Just 17, 14 to 18.
The people of Joseph said to Joshua, why have you given us only one allotment and one portion for an inheritance? We are a numerous people, and the Lord has blessed us abundantly. If you are so numerous, Joshua answered, and if the hill country of Ephraim is too small for you, go up into the forest and clear land for yourselves there in the land of the Perizzites and Rephaites. The people of Joseph replied, the hill country is not enough for us, and all the Canaanites who live in the plain have iron chariots, both those in Bethshan and its settlements and those in the valley of Jezreel. But Joshua said to the house of Joseph, to Ephraim and Manasseh, you are numerous and very powerful. You will have not only one allotment, but the forested hill country as well. Clear it, and its farthest limits will be yours. Though the Canaanites have iron chariots, and though they are strong, you can drive them out.
What are they doing? They're whining, right? They're whining. The forest and hill country they're talking about is up here, okay? They've been in the Jezreel Valley, which is in this area, and it's good land, nothing wrong with that. But Joshua says, if it's not enough, go clear the forest. This area was forested at the time. Go clear out the forest, clear the land. We don't want to clear out the land. That's a lot of work. And besides, if we don't clear out the land in the hill country, we come down the plains, there are Rephaites there. Do you know who they are? They're like the Anakites. Rephaim were also giants. And if you remember, Og he had a 15-foot by 6-foot bed, and he was one of the giants, and he was a Rephaite. So we don't want to fight the giants. And not only that, they got iron chariots. I mean, they got real technology. What does Joshua say to him? He says, no sympathy. Go get them anyway. He says, clear the land, kill the giants, and drive out the Canaanites and take your inheritance. You can have all that you want. All you've got to do is go north. You notice Manasseh occupied down here, but nothing's up here yet. Kingdom of Geshur was up there. It had not yet been conquered. And so Joseph says, you've got plenty of inheritance. You just need to go and take it. Well, at this point, chapter 18 begins. They actually changed the seat of government. That could have taken 6 months, a year, I don't know how long, but they had to move the whole camp. You got 1.5 million people. They had to move the camp from Gilgal over to Shiloh. Now, it may be that Judah, the tribe of Judah, started moving out to their inheritance, and maybe Manasseh and Ephraim started moving out to theirs. So you didn't have as many people, but nonetheless, they moved the seat of government to Shiloh, and Shiloh is located here, where you can see that little circle, okay? Not a big deal, but now we've got all except 7 tribes, right? We got 2.5 on the eastern side, and then we've got Judah and Ephraim and Manasseh on the western side, and half of Manasseh. And so we got 7 tribes left. What are they doing? Well, 18, 2-3.
But there were still 7 Israelite tribes who had not yet received their inheritance. So Joshua said to the Israelites, how long will you wait before you begin to take possession of the land that the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you?
Well, apparently they hadn't even started the survey process. It looks to me like at least Judah they were already out surveying the land, and they came back to Joshua and said, okay, this is the boundary land. These are the boundaries. We want you to endorse that, sign the deeds, and we're ready to go. Same thing with Ephraim and Manasseh, to their credit. These guys, they stayed in town. They stayed in the camp. And they said, well, you know, we're kind of comfortable here. They didn't value their inheritance enough to go and make it their own. They kind of let their inheritance be what everybody else had around them. They'd be taken care of. They were comfortable in camp. And they depended on their leader, Joshua, to take control and go and initiate the surveys. And that's exactly what he does. He says, all right, you're going to be that way? I want you to give me so many people from each tribe. I'm going to send them out. They're going to report back to me, and we'll give you your inheritance by lot. They had no control over their inheritance. It was just given to them, whatever they got, by virtue of the fact that they lived in the promised land and they were Israelites. Now, that gives us 4 groups, okay? And I think that's why this passage, besides being a record of the deeds and the boundaries of the tribes, that's why this passage is written the way it is. Because it tells us about 4 types of people. Each one of them has the right to an inheritance. That's the first thing. All of them have to struggle to possess the inheritance. But each of them has a different attitude toward his inheritance. Reuben and Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh, they preferred the land outside of Yahweh's land. They weren't that concerned with being where God was. They weren't concerned about being in the land he had promised. And then you had the 7 reluctant tribes. They weren't down for the struggle. They were just lazy. They liked being in the camp. They liked the fact that they had, pretty secure borders. Joshua's army is taking care of them. They didn't have to do a lot of struggling, and they just weren't down for the struggle. And so they were just going to stay there and do nothing. And then you got Joseph's tribes. They were willing to take their inheritance. They wanted to go out and get it, but that was too hard. There was too much involved. I can't do all that. And so they were a little bit passive, weren't they? They were defeatists. And then you got Judah and Caleb. And they stood and they fought the good fight. They fought the good fight, and they possessed their inheritance. It reminds me of Paul's words. He said, I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. Henceforth, there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness. That's his inheritance. And that's your inheritance and mine if we are Christ's followers. I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I have taken my inheritance. There's coming a day when we will appear before the judgment seat of Christ to receive the things that we have done in the body. That is our inheritance. In 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about it as being a foundation on which no other person can build save that which is given us by Christ, kind of like Joshua took all the big strongholds. He said, and you can build on it wood, hay, and stubble, or you can build on it gold, silver, and precious stones. But it will be tried by fire, and only that which remains will be given to you. So what are you putting on that foundation? Are you putting wood, hay, stubble? Are you putting gold, silver, and precious stones? Now, I don't want to spend a lot of, this way, for Jay. This is the current boundary of Israel. You can see it here. There's the Jordan, there's Syria, there's Lebanon. This is the Golan Heights, by the way, and here's the Gaza Strip that they had all the trouble recently. So much for that.
Where's Alvin's children?
Alvin's children, they're living now. They were living right up here in the Golan Heights. They were just miles from the war in Syria, and now they're down closer to the Sea of Galilee. They've had to move, probably for their protection. Well, then you have the cities of refuge. There's two chapters, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but if you got accused of murder, or if you inadvertently, second-degree murder, killed somebody, or you had a judgment against you, the tribe or the clan that you had offended would appoint one of their members to be the avenger of blood. His job was to go kill you. And that's perfectly legal. That's the justice system that they had. So they set up these cities of refuge, and the idea was if you could make it to a city of refuge, you'd get a fair trial. It's a good idea. Works out fine. And then you had the cities for Levi. Levi was not given any land. And there's two reasons. The Levitical tribe was attached to the tabernacle in the service of God. Their inheritance was the Lord. And they were, the children of Aaron were the priests, and the rest of the children of Levi attended to the priestly functions. And so you had Levites that get no land, but they got the proceeds of the gifts to the tabernacle or to the temple later on. And you can see the red circles are the cities of refuge, and all the rest, 48, are the cities given to Levi. And of course, they were spread among the people so that they could tend to the people's spiritual needs. Okay. Now, we get to chapter 23 and 24, which I think is where we really have something to say to ourselves. Now, 23 and 24 seem to be talking about two different events. I have a feeling they are, but they're very close together. There may have been a period of time when they assembled all the elders and Joshua addressed them and gave them his farewell to the leaders. And then he addressed a larger group of the people and renewed the covenant, and he passed on everything he could to them as a legacy. Joshua is concerned at this point. He's 110 years old. He is not far from death's door, and he is caring now all about the people that will follow him. Now, most of us here are getting to that point. We are getting long in the tooth. We're starting to have things go wrong, and trying to prolong life. But, we are beginning to get more and more concerned about those who come after us, our children, our grandchildren, those that we have been teaching, those that we may have been leading, and maybe our business. And Joshua is in the same boat. So he gives an address in chapter 23. Let's begin at verses 1 to 5.
After a long time had passed, and the Lord had given Israel rest from all their enemies around them, Joshua, by then old and well advanced in years, summoned all Israel, their elders, leaders, judges, and officials, and said to them, I am old and well advanced in years. You yourselves have seen everything the Lord your God has done to all these nations for your sake. It was the Lord your God who fought for you. Remember how I have allotted as an inheritance for your tribes all the land of the nations that remain, the nations I conquered between the Jordan and the great sea in the west. The Lord your God himself will drive them out of your way. He will push them out before you, and you will take possession of their land as the Lord your God promised you.
He's identifying what his legacy to these people is. And I think we can, by parallel, do the same thing. And I think these Old Testament stories, they're interesting from the archaeological perspective and from the development of Israel and the plan of redemption, but they're also great examples for us because they tell us a lot about ourselves. We saw that in the four groups we just talked about. and our inheritance and how we think about our inheritance. Well, here he's saying, this is my legacy to you. This is our inheritance. First of all, he's conquered the strongholds. Joshua, like Christ, has broken the power of the Canaanites, and Christ has broken the power of sin. And he says, I have conquered all these things for you. And I think you and I can say the same thing to some degree. Have we conquered the strongholds for our kids, for our grandkids? What can we give them to make their life easier? As Joshua gave, he gave the landscape to those people and made their life a whole lot easier. They didn't have to go after the king of Hazor. They didn't have to go after the king of Jerusalem and all those allies that he had. They taken care of that. And you and I could do the same thing. And I thought, what do we leave our children? What do we leave those that are behind us? And I think, like, 4 things come to mind. I think you can probably think of many more. We can give them a strong and loving home. I'll tell you, most of my second career was in manufacturing. And so I had rubbed shoulders with a lot of wonderful people in the blue collar ranks and at the very bottom of the economic pyramid. And I'm telling you, there's very, very few that have a mother and a father. There's very few who know what it's like to fulfill God's plan for marriage. They don't know who they are. To give them a stable, loving home is a huge advantage. And the older I get, the more I thank God that I grew up in such a home. Secondly, we can teach them discipline. And these guys that worked for me for all these years, their biggest problem is getting up and getting to work every day. They'll do it for the first 3 weeks. When payday comes, Mike, what happens after payday?
Fever on Monday.
Yeah, Monday fever, right? Sure. And I don't blame them terribly for it, because so many of them, they didn't have someone to tell them to get out of bed every morning. My dad used to come up in the dead of winter, throw off the covers, grab me by the ankle, and pull me off the bed. It's time to get up, pal. And I just didn't want to get out of bed. Sure. He taught me that. He taught me how to work. He taught me how to meet a deadline. He taught me the disciplines of life that you got to learn when you're young. And if you could do that to your kids or your grandkids, that's a huge blessing. Admiral William McRaven, commander of all special forces in 2014, gave a commencement address at University of Texas in Austin. And it's titled, Make Your Bed. And if you haven't heard it, get onto Google, type in Make Your Bed, and listen to that address. It is a fantastic address. Thirdly, we give them protection from things that could destroy them early in life. Protection from alcoholism. Those of you who may have had an alcoholic father know the heartbreak and the trouble that brings. You protect them from becoming alcoholics themselves by getting too much into the booze. But you also prevent them from getting involved in things like drugs, gangs, social media. We have the responsibility to give them some protection while they are young in the greenhouse of our family. And then we send them prepared into the world. And of course, one of the most important things we can give them is a Christian education. Now, I'm a big proponent of Christian schools and homeschooling. I think that's great. But even that's not what I'm talking about. To make your young people biblically literate, you've got to be biblically literate. That's why we come to this class. And it's vitally important that they understand who I am, why I'm here, where I came from, where I'm going. And that they are not alone in an empty, pitiless world. But there is a God who made them, who knows their thoughts, their hearts, and loves them anyway, and has provided a way of escape for them. That's vitally important. Secondly, he reminds them of all the things that they have seen in his life. Now, he's left memorials around Israel to their battles and the things that God did for them and so on and so forth. But ultimately, all your memorials, when you connect the dots, add up to a life. And I love what Paul the Apostle says to Timothy when he's at the end of his life. And he says, and I want you to just think of each one of these things in relationship to your own life. to my own life. You know all about my teaching, my way of life, my purpose, my faith, my patience, my love, endurance, persecutions for the gospel, sufferings, the common lot of man, how I handle them. Paul could say to Timothy, you've thoroughly known my life. And it is my life that is the memorial and the pattern for you. And one of the great privileges of growing up in a Christian home is that you've got patterns, you've got tapes. And if you didn't have that, you can make them for those who come after you. Vitally important. Well, then lastly, he gives them strong exhortation. And that's verses 6 through 8, chapter 23. Okay?
Be very strong. Be careful to obey all that is written in the book of the law of Moses without turning aside to the right or to the left. Do not associate with these nations that remain among you. Do not invoke the names of their gods or swear by them. You must not serve them or bow down to them, but you are to hold fast to the Lord your God as you have until now.
He starts out saying, obey the word of God. And it's interesting, chapter 1, verse 7 is almost identical word for word to this exhortation. God said to Joshua when he started out as the leader of the nation of Israel, read the word of God, commit it to your heart, do not turn to the left or to the right from it. Make it the center point of your life. And he's saying that to the people that follow him. That is the key. The word of God ought to be on your lips and in your heart and in your home all the time. Secondly, remain separate from the world. God has a right to expect his people, who are to be a holy people, to be different from the world around them. And that means sometimes breaking friendships and sometimes refusing to do some things. And in the days ahead, that may mean we're going to have to refuse to do certain things that are being demanded of us. And it's going to be a price we got to pay. And so be separate from the world. And then he says, hold fast to the Lord that you started with. And I've told you many times of my experiences about a 13-year-old boy. I was ushered into the deathbed of my granddad on my mother's side, who was a great man. I didn't know him well. I mean, in those days, he was a Victorian. I mean, you didn't know your grandparents in the way they do today, but I highly respected him. And he looked like a survivor from a death camp. He was just all skin and bones and all yellow from jaundice. But I remember one thing, and that's, he looked at me, just me. And I was alone with him. It was alone. The parents were here in the room, but he's going to talk to me now. And his eyes are burning like with flames because it's probably the fever. And he says, go with God. Go with God. He was a Swede. Go with God. Just with the urgency. Are you that urgent about your kids? Discipling them, telling those who you leave behind, the most important thing you do is to persevere in the faith. The doctrine of the perseverance of the saints is the saints are the ones who persevere. Are you persevering? Unfortunately, it didn't last. Joshua did all he could. He was obedient from beginning to end. There is really nothing bad said about Joshua. There's very few in the Bible, but that's the case. And yet, within a matter of just a generation, the nation forsook the Lord to serve pagan gods. Judges 2:6 and then 10-12.
After Joshua had dismissed the Israelites, they went to take possession of the land, each to his own inheritance. After the whole generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshiped various gods of the people around them. They provoked the Lord to anger.
You know, we were just talking this morning about members of our extended family who fell by the wayside, went off the rails, became prodigals, and we don't know if they'll come back or not. If I asked for a show of hands, there would be a lot of them here. We pray for some of your kids regularly. that are prodigals, that they would come back. Why? When you've done all that you have done, when you have raised them right, when you have given them the word of God, you have exemplified before them to the very best of your ability, and you've been faithful, why do some fall aside? Well, sin's like gravity. It's everywhere. I do not have a problem with forces pulling me up to more righteousness. That just is not my problem. I did not have to train my kids to lie. We had to train them to tell the truth. Human nature being what it is we will go astray. Isaiah 53:6, all we like sheep have gone astray. And we are like sheep. And we will wander away. There's a great song that says, prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the Lord I love. Take my heart and seal it for your courts above. Reminds us of the fact in Matthew 7 that wide is the gate, broad is the way that leads to destruction. Many there be that go that way. But narrow's the gate and narrow's the way that leads unto life, and few there be that find it. And our desire ought to be that those we are responsible for, those that we are ministering to, those that are following us, that they remain faithful and that they follow that way to life. Sin's like gravity. Secondly, idolatry is sometimes tolerated. We have tolerated our idols. What is an idol? Well, besides being a statue in the old days, an idol is anything to which you go for meaning, anything you turn to for what you need that isn't God. And we do that a lot. We turn to our money. We turn to our relationships. We turn to whatever it is that we want more than we want to be pleasing to the Lord. You know, in chapter 24, I won't have you read the whole thing, but Joshua is now talking to the people at large. Probably not everybody, but he's probably talking to all the assembly. That would be the joint houses of Congress. And he gives this famous challenge. He said, look, if you think it's better to serve the gods that you left behind or the gods of the Canaanites that you've seen here, go for it. He said, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. You know that challenge? But you have to go beyond that. Because then in verse 16 and 18, the people say, oh, no. We will serve the Lord, Jehovah, Yahweh. We will serve the Lord. I mean, we will do that. And then Joshua challenges them again. He says in verse 19, he says, oh, no, you won't. You can't serve the Lord because the Lord is a jealous God. He demands a holy people. He will not overlook your sins. And then they said, oh, no, we will serve the Lord. We promise we will. And then Joshua hits them when it hurts, and he says, then put away the foreign gods that are among you. They were there. They kept their gods with them. They kept those things that God finds to be detestable, and they hid them in their tent. And he says, throw away the foreign gods, verse 23, that are among you. And then he says, and yield your hearts to the Lord. We talked about this some time ago. It always comes down to a matter of the heart, doesn't it? It's always a matter of the heart. God wants your hearts. He doesn't want you to keep the rules as much as he wants to gain your heart and the person you are. And then lastly, they'd lost their leader. And we are sheep, and we need leadership. And nobody rose to the position of leadership that Joshua had. And consequently, the people went astray. So he was disappointed. He would have been disappointed. I'm disappointed. And when one of our loved ones, those that we care so much about, goes away, and we got to figure out, how do I deal with this? What do I do when my son who's grown up wants to bring his gay lover with him and stay at our house? A lot of practical questions. We got to decide how to deal with them. And we need to do the best we can to influence them in this handoff. First thing we need to do is encourage our kids to choose. Elijah said on Mount Carmel, remember that? He said to all the people gathered there, he said, look, how long are you going to waffle between two opinions? You choose now who's your God. You choose whom you're going to serve. Make a choice and live by it. And that's what Joshua says. As for me and my house, he says, I can't speak for the rest of you, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Secondly, give your hearts to Christ. Put away your idols and yield your hearts. That's what we talked about earlier in the covenant. Circumcise your hearts. God is interested in who you are when nobody's looking. He's interested in what you are at the very center of your being, and he wants that as much as he wants your obedience to the rules. Obey the word of God. That's extremely important. Those words are your life. Then he says, separate yourselves. Drive out the Canaanites. Be different. Do not associate with these nations that remain among you. Don't bow down to their gods. Now, what they did was they didn't drive out the Canaanites so much as they would take a city and they would say, now we're going to destroy your city unless you pay a tax. A little revenue. We get some money. Because they were getting prosperous. They had their farms. They wanted to be affluent, and they had an opportunity to get some money from these guys. And they put them to tribute and forced labor. And they said, why drive out the Canaanites when we can use them, right? Problem was, before long, their children were worshiping their gods and found them to be irresistible. Francis Schaeffer said back in the 70s, he said that the problem for the church in the coming decades will be our love of personal peace and affluence. I really don't want to get into the struggle. I'm not up for the struggle. I just want to enjoy the life I've got. I live an affluent life. We all do. By any standards in this world, we're affluent. I want personal peace and affluence. The problem is, those who come after us don't see any reason why they shouldn't worship the Baals, because the Baals were all about personal peace and affluence. Seek out good leaders, good leadership. It matters the church you go to. It matters the schools that your kids or your grandkids go to. It matters the companions, the spouses, the authors they read, all that. Seek out Joshua's. Pass them on to your kids, to all those that follow you. And lastly, and probably most important, pray diligently for those you leave behind. Can you guarantee the outcome? No, you cannot. And you should not agonize over the fact that you may have lost one of your loved ones that you were responsible for. God does not demand you be successful necessarily. He demands that you be faithful. If you're upset, be upset with the fact that you have been unfaithful and promise that you will become more faithful. But God only asks that you and I be faithful. And then pray for those we love. That is really where we are going as a group. We are getting older and older, and we can do less and less, but we can do more and more praying for our loved ones. And we should become warriors of prayer. I think this class is good at that, and I want us to get better. James chapter 5:16 says, the effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. Can I guarantee the outcome? No, I can't. Can I affect it? I think I can. Because God will listen to our prayers. And I think many of us here are blessed and have avoided a lot of trouble and a lot of sin because of the prayers of a righteous mother or a godly dad. And we want to be that person. Now, I want to end this by having you think of two things. Think of the word age. Think of your age, right? When I turned 50, somebody said that in a boardroom meeting we were having, and the CEO, who was this gruff guy, he says, oh yeah, I remember that. It's not the end of your life, but you can see it from there. That's true, isn't it? And the older we get, the more we think about that. We're getting nearer home, and we are running out of time. But I want you also to think about the age. It seems to me that we are living in the last days. And you'll talk about that this coming weekend. I hope you're all here to hear Doug Cobb and Len talk about these issues, because there's a lot of signs of the times. Now, there have been signs of the times all through the history of the church, but these signs are pretty acute. And seems to be that Christ may come soon. We are running out of time. And Jesus said, work while there's daylight, because the time is coming when you will not be able to work anymore. We're running out of time ourselves. We're running out of time in the age that we live. And there is coming a day when the door to the ark will be shut. God shuts that door. And when he shuts it, no amount of screaming or crying or carrying on will open it. In Revelation 22:11, there's a verse that has always impressed me. It says, let the one who does wrong continue to do wrong. Let the one who is vile continue to be vile. Let the one who does right continue to do right, and let the one who is holy continue to be holy. And what that verse is saying is there is coming a time of eternal separation. God will judge the earth. Those whose names are in the book of life will be forgiven, and their sins are gone, and they are considered holy, and God will be their God and will dwell with them. And those who do not have their names written in that book are gone forever. There will be a permanent separation forever. In other words, the time to choose is running out. Time to choose is running out. Maybe not so much for us because of so much is behind us, but we influence that next generation. And we need to do all we can to put before them that fundamental question. Choose this day. Who are you going to serve? It's going to matter. It's going to have consequences. It's going to have a price to pay in the days ahead. Choose it and do all that we can. Because for me and my house, come hell or high water, for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Let's close.